Hi everyone, Joe Garth here, creator of Brushify.io. In this video, I want to talk a little bit about parallax occlusion mapping. Now, this is quite an old feature. It's been around for, I think, as long as, since 2007 or something. I think Crysis was one of the first games to ever have this feature. So it's been around almost 15 years now. But it's still a very powerful shader technique, and it's very interesting and useful. And what this allows you to do is effectively create fake depth in a landscape material. So instead of tessellation, where it actually uses more polygons and geometry to create a 3D depth in the landscape, what parallax occlusion mapping is basically doing is sort of layering passes, and it's sort of a way of kind of faking depth on the material. And I think it's quite convincing, and it's also pretty cheap. So I think it's a really cool option to have in Brushify, and that was actually added in the last update. So yeah, if you enable parallax occlusion mapping, you will get this effect. In this video, I'm going to be showing how you can build your own little parallax occlusion mapping paint layer, and how you can utilize the effect on your own custom paint layers. All right, let's get started. So in order to show parallax occlusion mapping, I'm going to open up a couple of the Brushify example levels so you guys can sort of see it in action. Here I've got a completely blank project. I've just installed some Brushify packs to it. So you can see I've got basically just the dunes pack here, the mountains pack, and I'm going to be using these two initially just to demonstrate how parallax occlusion mapping looks and how to enable and disable it. So first, the dunes level. Just going to load up the level here, and let's take a look. Let's just give it a second to load. Don't worry if it's a little laggy when things are first loading. It just has to build and compile a lot of stuff. But once everything gets running, yep, we have a really nice frame rate. And if you look at the ground here, you can see there is this sort of 3D depth effect taking place that makes it look like these dunes really have some real 3D depth. And that's parallax occlusion mapping. It's such a powerful technology because this doesn't actually use any real hardware tessellation. It's purely a shader effect that takes place in the UVs. So just to show how cool this is, we can actually go to the lit menu and go to optimization view modes and to shader complexity. And here you can see that we've actually still got quite decent pixel shader performance. It's nothing too heavy on the pixel shader. Obviously, if you put more paint layers down and things like that, things are going to get a little heavier. But in general, this is still quite an affordable effect, and it does take quite a lot of pressure off the GPU when it comes to tessellation. The other landscape that I wanted to show you is the mountains pack. So if I come up to the mountains pack, let's just do the same thing here. So you can see here on the ground, there's again the same thing. We've got this parallax occlusion mapping effect. It's giving us this nice depth. So in order to enable and disable this parallax occlusion mapping effect, the first thing you want to do is just click on your landscape, any Brushify landscape basically, and come to the details panel. And then just scroll down and find the landscape material slot. And then you want to hit this little magnifying glass under MI landscape, and that'll bring up the content browser. And here you'll be able to find whatever MI landscape is applied to your landscape material slot, and just double click it. I'm just going to close that content browser window. And then if we just zoom in here on the landscape here, and we also go to the MI landscape and sort of scroll down till we find the POM section. And inside the POM section, you'll find basically a bunch of different parameters for parallax occlusion mapping. By default, all of these will be unticked, just like this. And you'll see use parallax occlusion mapping. And by default, on some maps, this is ticked. On other Brushify maps, it's unticked. And that's because it does obviously contribute a little bit to performance. So if it's not needed, make sure you untick it. But if you do untick it, you'll see that certain paint layers don't look so great. So for instance, this paint layer is the snow paint layer, And you can see that without parallax occlusion mapping, it's very flat looking. And although there's some sort of lighting going on and the normal maps are doing quite a good job, you're not getting that sort of real 3D depth effect. So if we enable it, you can really see the big difference of having this sort of fake displacement on the landscape. And that's just the great thing about parallax mapping. It basically allows you to have fake displacement, so it's all the benefits of the visuals of hardware tessellation without having to do real hardware tessellation at all. And the way this actually works is by basically, it's almost like a sort of layering effect. It's actually fake, fake depth. So if we look down here, you can see if we get really, really close to it, it's kind of still working, but you start to see these sort of kinks in the armor. It's actually not real 3D. It's just sort of a projection, or it's sort of based on a number of layers. Yeah, basically the more depth that you give it, the more sort of obvious the layers will become. So just to demonstrate that, I'm going to open the landscape again, and I'm just going to change this POM height ratio, and let's just make that really high. Maybe not that high. Let's make it 0.1. So now you can see as we sort of raise it, it's starting to lose the effect. Like the effect's starting to become too obvious, and we're getting this kind of liquid sort of floating thing. So the default value of 0.04 I think is quite nice. If we go to 0, we can see now there's no depth at all. Just up it a little bit, you start to see a little bit of depth, and then at the default value we've got quite a lot. And the idea is that this will hold up from sort of normal first person height. So if you're a player looking down at the ground, this is going to look good and hold up. Or if you're up here in third person, this is going to look good. But if you get really, really close to it, it's obviously not going to look as good as real hardware tessellation. And that's just because of the way this works with the sort of stepping. You can, of course, increase sort of the number of if you go really wild, you get some crazy effects like this. So you can really see like what's happening under the hood there. You definitely want to keep with the default values. But yeah, if we really go crazy with this, we can also see that if we change the stepping effect, the stepping amounts, this does actually alter the amount of steps that are available. So if we change it to 100 steps, now you're starting to see that we are actually able to get something that looks okay with that. But obviously, the more steps that you add, the worse it's going to be for performance. So that's why it's just, it's much better if you can stick to the default values, because they're actually optimized and sort of tweaked. And I've sort of carefully selected these default values so that they look good. You can also get a bit more performance by lowering the amount of stepping. But I think the performance increase is pretty much negligible, and what you're going to find is that you'll lower the quality slightly by reducing stepping further. So it's up to you really. You've got a lot of power with these different parameters, and you can sort of tweak and change those to your liking. In order to demonstrate how to add parallax occlusion mapping to a custom paint layer, I've just come into the starter level here, which I think is a good place to sort of demonstrate this. So I'm going to paint down a little bit of the mud layer. So to do that, I'm going to go to Modes, Landscape, and then I'm going to go to the Paint panel and just give it a second to load a few shaders. Let's make our brush size a little bit lower. And then I'm going to click on Mud. And it should already have a layer info applied if you're in the starter level. And yeah, let's make a little bit of patch of mud here on the ground. It's the first time painting, so it's going to take a little bit. And yeah, as you can see, it looks okay, but the problem is that there isn't actually any depth here in this mud. So what we're going to do is we're going to add basically a height map setup and parallax occlusion mapping setup for this paint layer, so this mud layer actually gets parallax occlusion mapping. So very first thing, I'm going to make sure that parallax mapping is actually on in the MI landscape. So just like before, like we showed in the other levels, just scroll down and enable POM. and that's going to recompile. But unlike the other situations, you'll see that we're not actually going to get any parallax effect on this paint layer. And that's because parallax occlusion mapping isn't set up for the mud layer. Unlike the dunes layer that we showed before and the snow layer, this one is not set up out of the box. So in order to add parallax mapping to this layer, we're going to go to Brushify, Materials, Landscape, and then in the Materials folder, look for the Mud folder. And this basically has all of the sort of mud-related paint layers or material functions for the paint layers stored. So inside is mud stuff, and there's also the puddles layer, which we can also paint down as well. But if we come into mud here, you can see that we've got the same setup that you're pretty much used to seeing from other tutorials, other Brushify Bootcamp tutorials that came before this, such as the custom paint layer setup tutorial. So if you've been following through this series, you'll be aware pretty much of how this is laid out and how it's set up. So what we're going to do though is we're going to actually check out another example and use that to set up this paint layer as a parallax occlusion mapping paint layer. And you'll be able to apply this technique to your own paint layers. So for instance, if you followed this tutorial before and you created your own cliff rock paint layer by following the custom paint layers tutorial, you'll be able to apply the same technique to convert this into parallax occlusion mapping. And it's really actually quite simple. So yeah, I'm going to go to browse, and instead of opening mud, I'm going to open up puddles. And inside of here, you can see that we've got a very similar material function. Pretty much the layout's exactly the same. We've still got global tiling, macro tiling, detail tiling, and they're all hooked up. But there is one slight difference, which is if we look down here, we've got the MF puddles height, and that's actually got, it's another material function, and it's got two outputs. One is for the height, and that goes into the set material attributes node up here. And then the other is POM, and that goes into UVs. Now to explain this, the height is actually for the displacement, the real displacement, which, if you go into MI Landscape and you scroll down, you can find tessellation right here. And that's what that height is actually used for. It's for this tessellation function. So that's real, like hardware tessellation. But the other parameter here, POM, that's actually just for the parallax occlusion mapping. So right here, where you can see parallax occlusion mapping, this feature, this is what the POM output is used for. And that's actually connected directly to this texture, which is the detail texture. So in the case of the puddles layer, this is the detail texture. And you can see on there, we've got these puddles kind of laid in there, and it's kind of a muddy texture. So you still need to set up your textures exactly the same as before in this sort of way. The only thing that you need to do is have this extra height function. So in order to create that, we're just going to jump inside of that and see how that's set up. It's also a pretty simple thing. It's basically just that the detail tiling goes to basically a texture sample, and the texture sample gets its texture from a texture object, and the texture object is basically fed into this little landscape POM function. So we've sort of got functions in functions, and it does get a little bit complicated because POM requires UVs to be manipulated. But these two functions are really the only thing you need. So if you're really stuck on this, just copy what I do sort of step by step. And really, I'm going to explain what I'm doing. I'm going to be taking these functions from the puddles layer, and I'm going to be copying them over to the mud layer and getting the mud layer set up with parallax mapping. So you can actually use this exact technique that I'm about to show you to add the parallax occlusion mapping setup to any of the custom paint layers that you've made throughout Brushify Bootcamp. So yeah, really this is just a case of sort of copying and pasting a few of the already set up things from the puddles layer, and then we're going to be copying them over onto the mud layer. And you can pretty much copy them over onto any of the custom paint layers that you've made with the mud layer, because really what I do in these tutorials is pretty much just copy paste the mud layer and then switch out the textures for our own custom textures, whether those are sort of mega scans or some custom thing that's downloaded from somewhere else. So yeah, this is really the point of this tutorial, is just so that you guys can quickly add parallax occlusion mapping to your own paint layers. So first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to copy this MF landscape POM, and then I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to open up MF mud height. So the very first thing I'm going to do is set up the heights. And yeah, basically we can copy and paste this landscape POM in there, and really we can just, actually the best thing to do is just copy and paste all of this, because we're going to need the whole thing. And you can see that right now it's still set up with the mud, with the puddles texture. So instead of the puddles texture, we're just going to take the mud texture, and we're just going to bring that and put that in instead. So now we've got everything we need. We're going to put in the detail tiling UVs, and again those can go straight across into near texture, and then this is now not needed anymore. This is the old one, and don't need that. And basically that can just go like this. So now we've got something that's starting to look similar. We also need to connect up this UV's input here. And if we go over to the puddles height, we can check where that goes in. And you can see that it goes into the UV slot from detail tiling. So you see right there, detail tiling. So all we need to do is just hook up detail tiling to UVs. And there we go. And now we've got one thing that's missing, which is the output POM, and you can see that doesn't actually go anywhere. So we don't need to connect this up to anything. That's actually a function output. But that's pretty much, if we just make this a little bit more tidy, that's pretty much everything I need to do in the mud height in order to set up parallax occlusion mapping. So I'm going to hit save. And that's going to take a little bit of time to compile shaders. But yeah, while it does that, we can take a look at the next thing that we're going to be updating. And that's going to be the main sort of albedo pass. And if we go to our MF mud, you can actually see that we've got this new POM output here. So that's actually similar now to MF puddles. We've actually got down here this height and POM. So all we need to do is just drag that down here somewhere. I'm going to also make this little, just double click on the wire to make this a little bit more tidy. And then that's still going to the same thing, world displacement. We can check that. Now we've got the exact same setup here. This is going to world displacement. And really all I'm doing is just copying from, a setup material function to one that isn't set up yet. And that's really all you need to do. Just copy the exact setup and layout. And yeah, so then we can see that POM goes directly into the detail texture sample. So POM to detail texture. And it's the detail texture sample because if you look at the UV input, you can see that it's going into detail tiling. And it should also say on it detail close texture if you copied the setup from the mud layer, which is the usual one that I use as an example, by the way, because it's kind of the mud layer isn't really directly related to any particular biome, and it's more of a sort of, I kind of use it in tutorials and stuff, it's a kind of demonstration layer of, how you can replace this layer with something of your own. Obviously you can still use mud, but it's one of those things you can just swap the textures out for. So I'm going to hook up POM, and there we go. Now we should have the parallax occlusion mapping UVs. So if we pretty much follow this whole thing along POM, then we go into this, we can see that that's actually going to the landscape POM function, and that's where the parallax occlusion mapping UVs are basically formed. So that's how this works really. So yeah, let's go back to MF mud, and again we're going to hit save, and it's going to compile shaders again, and we also need to do it the same exact change to the normals. So if we go into puddles and check out the puddles normals, You can see how those are set up. And really this is very simple at this point, because all we need to do is hook up puddles height to the UVs. So we need to do Faraz mud height to the UVs. And that's actually really easy because, well, there are two ways we can do this. One, we can just take the, if we go into MF mud, we can just copy and paste mud height into mud normals. The other thing you could do is just type in material function call and then just switch that to mud height, and that would also get you it. But then all you need to do is just hook up the output POM to the UVs here. And there we go. And we got to do the same thing for the roughness. If we check in the puddles roughness, you can see the same thing. Basically there is the same setup. And let's go into mud roughness and do the same thing. So copy it in. So I'm just going to tidy up this up here a little bit so you can really see what I've done. We don't need to save any of the puddle stuff that we've changed. And there we can see that now what we should have in the final setup, if I just save these, always make sure that whenever you make a change to any function, you just save the function and it will just compile the shaders for that function. So now we should have all four of these set up with POM. And I'm just going to walk through each of them and show you the changes that I made, which are just basically copied from the puddles layer. So, you know, if you ever want to reference, look at the puddles layer, look at any of the other paint layers that are already set up with POM and just see how those are set up. But yeah, dead simple. The height is here so that the hardwire tessellation still works. And then for all the rest of them, you just take the POM, put that into the UVs of the detail texture. And that's how that one's set up. The height, the super important one, that's basically just make sure you copy the setup from puddles, and that just basically takes the detail tiling UVs, puts them through this landscape POM material function, then outputs the POM, and it also uses this texture sample right here to basically allow us to put the height through for the hardwire tessellation. And the normals, dead simple. It's just the mud height, the POM output into UVs, and then that goes straight through into the near texture. Mud roughness, same thing as the mud normals. Again, the mud height into the UVs, straight through into the near texture. And yeah, this is basically all you need to do in order to get the parallax occlusion mapping set up. So if in doubt, just go into puddles, look inside of the paint layer, look inside of the material function, check how that setup is, and make sure you copy the exact same setup. Make sure that the connectors are connected in the exact same way. Make sure you've applied the right textures and that the textures that you actually want are set up correctly. And then you're going to be pretty much fine, I think. So just to show you that this is working now, we are going to go to the viewport here, and we can actually see, or we can start to see, that there is actually some real depth happening on this mud layer. I might exaggerate a little bit because it's actually not super obvious on this one. But to do that, I can go up to Content, and I can go to the Materials, Landscape, Materials, Mud, and I'm going to go into the Height. And in here, we can go to that texture, which is the Mud H texture, and open up that texture as a little window. And you can see here in adjustments, I can actually adjust the height map in real time. So what I'm going to do is go crazy with it. And you'll be able to see that as I go crazy with it, it's actually going to show. It's not going to look very good right now because I'm going crazy with the values. But you can actually see the amount of offset that's happening. Let's tweak it a little bit. Make some changes here. Maybe 1.5. But you can really see like the impact that it almost looks like you've got little mounds forming in the texture. So there's that way of doing it where you can change the actual height map texture itself to sort of increase the amount of bump. But the other way that you can do it is actually in the MI landscape itself, where we've actually got a few more parameters here, so more advanced parameters for parallax occlusion mapping. So one of the advanced parameters that we can use, which is quite nice, is the height ratio. So here we've got it set to 0.04. If we increase that to 0.08, you got a similar effect to increasing the texture, except that you can see that we're not reaching that sort of clamped limit of the height. But what you will see is that the higher you go, the more you sort of see this kind of stepping effect. So it's going to start to give away the fact that it's not real displacement. So there is a certain limit to how much you can make this go, basically. And yeah, if you keep it at the default values, I think it usually gives you, pretty good results. This is only supposed to be a sort of subtle effect that gives you a little bit more sort of 3D depth and kind of avoids the flat look that we had before. So I mean, just to show you how it looked before, we can untick POM, and you can really see the difference there, like how flat this looks. Just makes it look completely sort of last gen, and looks like a game from 10 years ago. And then we enable this. Now we've got this beautiful little bumps going on. It is actually possible as well to enable shadows on this, but it would be extremely expensive. If you do actually want to do that, you can actually manipulate the parallax occlusion mapping function itself. So in order to do that, you would go inside of this little function here, the landscape POM, and you would want to basically alter the parallax occlusion mapping function. And there are a lot of settings here for shadows, which you can tweak and sort of play with, but this is definitely more advanced stuff, and obviously it will affect performance. So yeah, if you do want to play around with these things, you can try adding your own little parameters to these, and getting some more advanced sort of shadowing effects and things that way. But I do find that maybe shadows aren't really that important for vast majority of landscapes and situations. The shadows on that kind of like that sort of low level of detail, that sort of hyper micro level of detail is maybe not important. But if you are working on something high end like a cinematic, or if you're really wanting to go next gen, that is an option right there for you to play around with those settings. But yeah, in general, I think the parallax mapping is really stable. It's a very nice sort of cheap way of adding detail to the landscape without having to use real displacement or going crazy with tons of assemblies and stuff like that. And yeah, it's one of the new features of Brushify that I'm really proud of, and think it's going to be very, very useful for a lot of people.